This is the third in a series of talks on revitalizing manufacturing in America that was presented first at the Lansing Lions Club. I would like to thank my fellow Lions for sponsoring this presentation today. As always, I will begin with my standard disclaimer. The opinions in this talk are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any employer, past or present, or of anyone else. The first talk in this series explained why America's skyrocketing imbalance of trade is its most important deficit, and in fact, a key factor that causes America's skyrocketing foreign debt. It is more than coincidence that America's foreign debt has grown along with its trade deficit. The U.S. will keep living beyond its income for as long as imports exceed exports. That is not just a theory or a general tendency. It follows directly from the definition of national income. That first talk went on to explain that restoring manufacturing is a matter of national survival because of the serious military, financial, and economic dangers that America would face as a post-industrial nation. The second talk in the series outlined a strategy for restoring manufacturing in America by reducing the overhead costs of employers. That talk showed how overhead costs can be reduced by approximately $20,000 per worker by changing the way that America pays for Social Security, health care, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, pensions, and general government. The share of the nation's overhead costs that is now paid by consumers would still be paid by consumers, but by consumers of imported goods as well as consumers of American goods. Buying American goods would no longer involve paying more than your share of America's overhead costs. Buying imported goods would no longer be a way to avoid paying your share of America's overhead costs. The share of overhead costs now borne by workers would still be borne by workers, and the share now borne by shareholders and business owners would still be borne by shareholders and business owners. But Americans whose firms operate primarily in America would no longer cover more than their share of the nation's overhead costs, and Americans whose firms operate primarily abroad would no longer pay less than their share. The key to implementing this strategy is to replace some of the current taxes that drive jobs away from America with new taxes that can bring jobs back. Those taxes were described in that previous talk, so I will not describe them in detail again. What I want to focus on in this talk is one of the challenges in implementing the strategy. One of the keys to making this strategy politically acceptable is to keep the relative burdens of consumers and workers and owners unchanged. That requires setting the new taxes at a reasonable level and then adjusting them on a continuous basis as the new approach is gradually implemented. That does not sound like an easy task. The Constitution grants taxing authority to the legislative branch of the federal government, and the legislative branch is not known for setting taxes at just the right level and then adjusting them on a continuous basis as conditions change to keep them at just the right level. The legislative branch cannot always even agree about whether or not America will pay its bills. How can we expect it to implement the new strategy that was described in the last talk? Well, I think that there is a good solution. It is even an easy solution. It is a very simple approach that will take just a few minutes to explain. The approach that I will describe in a few minutes can accomplish those objectives while enhancing the control of the U.S. economy that rightfully belongs to the legislative branch. When I describe it, it might sound like just a new way to implement tax policy, but what makes it important is that it is part of a strategy for securing America's health and survival by restoring manufacturing. Keep that thought in mind, because I am going to come back to it. But first, I'm going to start this talk over with a new introduction. The introduction that you just heard made some important points, but I think you will find the next introduction more interesting. Most cars have two pedals. To make your car go faster, you press down on the accelerator. When you let up on the accelerator, the car goes more slowly. If you really want to slow it down, you step on the brake. Driving the nation's economy is more complicated than driving a car. If you could look inside the U.S. economy, you would see two accelerator pedals and two brake pedals. There is a fiscal accelerator, government spending. There is a fiscal brake, taxes. There is a monetary brake, interest rates. and there is a monetary accelerator, the creation of money. Each pedal has a whole team of people responsible for its operation. Each pedal speeds the economy up or slows it down in a somewhat different way, and each pedal has other effects upon the economy as well. And instead of just one pedal being used at a time, they are all used at once. There is always some level of government spending, some level of taxation, some level of interest rates, and some level of money creation. The federal government and the Federal Reserve Board can make the economy go faster and create more jobs by pressing harder on one or both of the accelerators, or by letting up on one or both of the brakes. They can make the economy go slower and generate less inflation by pressing harder on one or both of the brakes, or by letting up on one or both of the accelerators. Now, you might have noticed that the economy has not been running as well as you would like over the past few years. One reason is that some of these pedals have not been working as well as they used to. Government spending is an important accelerator, but that pedal is stuck. Pressing harder on that fiscal accelerator would create more jobs, but it would also increase a budget deficit that is already unsustainable. So legislators have not been able to agree about pressing much harder on that pedal, and they have not been able to agree about letting up on it very much either. Taxes are an important brake on the economy, but that pedal is stuck as well. Letting up on this fiscal brake pedal would lead to creating more jobs, but most economists believe that it would increase the budget deficit as well. So legislators have not been able to agree about pressing much harder on that fiscal brake pedal, and they have not been able to agree about easing up on it very much either. Interest rates are another important brake pedal. This pedal has served the nation well for several decades. When the Federal Reserve Board has identified a need to bring down inflation, it has taken steps to bring about an increase in interest rates. Likewise, when the economy has needed to grow faster, the Fed has taken steps to make interest rates fall. The good thing about this brake pedal is that it is usually very flexible and responsive. If the Fed wants interest rates to change by just a little bit, then it makes interest rates change by just a little bit. If it wants rates to change by a lot, then it makes rates change by a lot. If interest rates seemed just right last month, but this month they seem to be too high or too low, then this month is when the Fed will cause them to change. The pedals that control fiscal policy have never been that flexible and responsive. So this monetary brake pedal has gotten a lot of use. For the past several years, however, the Fed has practically taken its foot off this pedal altogether. The economy has been moving too slowly, so the Fed has allowed interest rates to fall pretty close to zero. The limit for this pedal has been reached. Interest rates are about as low as they are going to go. There is not much more that the Fed can do with interest rates to speed up the economy. But there is another problem with this pedal that is even more serious. It cannot be used very effectively anymore to raise interest rates because the federal government cannot afford higher interest rates. When the time eventually comes that the economy needs to be cooled down to control inflation, this pedal might not be of very much use. A few figures will help explain why this is the case. In 2008, before the economy crashed, the U.S. government paid $451 billion in interest on the national debt, or 15% of total federal outlays. Between the middle of 2008 and the middle of 2011, the national debt increased by over 50%. In 2011, the U.S. government paid $454 billion in interest on the national debt, or 12% of total federal outlays. Even though the national debt had increased by over 50%, the interest payments held roughly steady. As a percentage of total federal outlays, interest payments actually went down. The reason is that interest rates went down from 2008 to 2011. Current interest rates are extraordinarily low. You have to go back to the 1940s and 50s to find interest rates on federal debt that are lower than the rates that the government is paying as of early 2012. These low interest rates are playing a critical role in keeping the government's debt burden manageable. But what if interest rates had been at the level of, say, 2007? That would have made interest rates 71% higher than they actually were. The resulting figure is equivalent to 20% of total federal outlays in 2011. If interest rates had been at the level of 1982, that would have caused interest payments to be 4 times as high as they actually were. That figure is equivalent to 47% of total federal outlays in 2011. And that just reflects the level of debt in 2011. If the level of debt keeps increasing, then the future debt burden will be even greater. America cannot afford to step on the monetary brake pedal, as hard as it was stepped on in 1982 or even in 2007. Someday, America will need to step hard on the brakes. When that day comes, the brake pedal that raises interest rates will be prohibitively expensive to use. There's one more pedal that I want to talk about, and that is the creation of money. Some of the terms you may have heard that involve this pedal are printing money, quantitative easing, and monetizing the debt. The good news about the monetary accelerator pedal is that it still works just about as well as ever. This pedal has been used quite a lot lately because it is pretty much the only pedal that is still working. Injecting money into the economy at the right time and in the right place provides a powerful stimulus to economic activity. When money is circulating too slowly, the Department of Treasury or the Federal Reserve Board can respond by creating more money. A larger amount of money circulating slowly can have just about the same effect as a smaller amount of money circulating normally. The bad news is that this pedal has always been a little quirky. It does not work in quite the same way as the gas pedal in your car. Sometimes the economy can keep accelerating even after taking pressure off this pedal. The economy can keep trying to surge ahead because the money that was already created is starting to circulate faster. That can lead to a high rate of inflation. So this is a dangerous pedal to use unless you have really good brakes. Well, one of America's problems right now is that its brake pedals are not working. The tax pedal is stuck, and we cannot afford to use the interest rate pedal very much. That might not seem like an urgent problem right now because the economy is going up a steep hill, so we do not really seem to need any brakes. But someday, America will come around a curve and find itself at the top of the hill. If we have not done something about the brakes before that day comes, then we will be in for an interesting ride. That is a serious problem. But I think that there is a good solution. It is even an easy solution. It is a very simple approach that will take just a few minutes to explain. The approach that I will describe in a few minutes can get the pedals working better and even make it possible to stimulate the economy more effectively without as much danger of inflation. Keep that vehicle without brakes in mind, along with the urgent need to restore manufacturing in America. I am going to come back to those ideas. But first, I am going to start this talk over with a new introduction. The 2 introductions that you have heard so far explain why this talk is important for America's future, but you also need to know why it is important now. The nation's economy has always had its ups and downs. This chart shows the number of jobs per thousand population in the U.S. from 1970 through 2010. The number of jobs goes down in each recession, and then it goes back up in each recovery. These ups and downs have been a lot more extreme for my home state of Michigan than for the U.S. as a whole. Each recession has had a much worse effect on Michigan than on the rest of the nation. I think that provides a clue to what sort of economic policy might make recessions less serious for the nation as a whole. The most important explanation that I know of for Michigan's deep recessions is that each recession has been preceded by an increase in interest rates. Those increases in interest rates are represented by the vertical red lines that appear shortly before each recession. The Federal Reserve Board takes steps to increase interest rates when it needs to cool down the economy to prevent inflation. That makes it more expensive and more difficult to borrow money for a new car. That has a bigger effect on Michigan than on any other state. It would be very good for Michigan if the nation had another suitable tool besides interest rates for cooling down the economy. Then Michigan's recessions might stop being so much worse than the nation's recessions. And it would be good for the entire nation if the economy could be cooled down in a manner that did not lead to such deep recessions in the first place. It would be even better if that alternative tool for controlling inflation made it possible for the nation to recover from recessions more quickly. I think that there is a good solution for those problems. It is even an easy solution. It is a very simple approach that will take just a few minutes to explain. The approach that I will describe in a few minutes can give the nation a powerful and flexible tool for controlling inflation that should be less likely to cause deep national recessions. It should even make it possible to recover from recessions more quickly. Keep those deep recessions in mind, along with that vehicle hurtling downhill without brakes, and the dangers faced by a nation without factories. I will come back to all of those ideas after I start this talk over again with another new introduction. The first three introductions established the importance of this talk, but the next introduction provides the key that is necessary for understanding it. I do not like paying taxes. I know that this economic brake pedal plays some important functions. One of my professors in graduate school used to say that taxes are one of the oldest and most important inventions of civilization. Even the politicians that seem to despise taxes the most do not generally propose to do away with them altogether. Even they cannot get around the fact that taxes are one of the oldest and most important inventions of civilization. But I still do not like paying taxes. When you come down to it, there is really just one reason why I do not like paying taxes. When I pay money in taxes, I have less money to spend on other things. If I could pay my taxes without reducing the amount of money that I have to spend on other things, then I would not really mind taxes at all. As a taxpayer, having just as much money to spend on other things after I pay my taxes sounds like a really good idea. As an economist, however, I understand that having less money to spend on other things is sometimes just what the economy needs. When the economy is getting overheated and there is too much circulation of money relative to the goods and services that can be made available for sale, then economic policymakers have to find a way to get people to spend less. If they did not do that, then the amount of purchasing power would go down anyway because of too much inflation. Economic policymakers try to keep the demand for goods and services high enough to encourage a healthy rate of economic growth, but low enough to prevent excessive inflation. The usual strategy for getting people to spend less has been to increase interest rates. That does the job, but in a rather crude and imprecise sort of way. Interest rates have more impact on some people than on others. People who need to buy or sell a house during a period of high interest rates bear a disproportionate burden. Those high interest rates can cost them thousands of dollars extra. People in the construction industry and the real estate industry bear a disproportionate burden. Those high interest rates can cost them their jobs. People with adjustable rate loans bear a disproportionate burden. They can pay thousands of dollars extra. People who need to buy a car, or people who build cars or sell cars, or live in a state that builds cars, bear a disproportionate burden. Students and other individuals and businesses that need to borrow money at that particular time bear a disproportionate burden. Many other people are not affected very much at all. Their jobs continue, except perhaps with a little less prosperity, because the people bearing a disproportionate burden have a lot less money to spend. An increase in interest rates also makes the national debt more burdensome by increasing the amount of interest that the government has to pay. That is a bad thing for all of us. On top of that, this rather crude tool for slowing down the economy often slows it down too much and leads to a recession. It does reduce the amount of money that people have to spend, but it does so in an indirect sort of way. When I first talked about this brake pedal, I tried to be polite and emphasized that it is flexible and responsive, in the sense that this pedal can be pressed hard or pressed gently, and it can be pressed as soon as the need arises. But some other words that come to mind are imprecise, inefficient, and uneven. The effects of pressing this pedal are not immediate, and this pedal does not always have quite the desired level of effect. Those are not good qualities for a braking system. I think we can do better than that. When it becomes necessary to reduce the amount of money that people can spend, there is another way to bring that about. Taxes are really good at reducing the amount of money that people have to spend. The thing about taxes that I dislike the most turns out to be the thing that makes them useful for cooling down the economy when it becomes overheated. Taxes can also be designed in a way that everyone pays a suitable amount, instead of some people in some states being affected very powerfully, while others experience hardly any effect at all. Moreover, as long as the increase in taxes is not accompanied by an increase in spending, it will reduce the national debt instead of making it more burdensome, as would be the case with an increase in interest rates. I still would not like paying the taxes, but when policymakers need to reduce the amount of money being spent, a tax seems to be the best available alternative. I would rather pay an extra $10 in taxes than lose that $10 through inflation, or pay an extra $20 in interest. But taxes will not be a viable tool for controlling inflation unless a way can be found to make tax rates as flexible and responsive as interest rates. Interest rates can be adjusted every month by the Federal Reserve Board, but sometimes it seems that tax rates cannot be adjusted at all. Well, I think that there is a good solution. It is even an easy solution. It is a very simple approach that will take just a few minutes to explain. It is possible for America to have a responsive and responsible fiscal policy, just as it has generally had a responsive and responsible monetary policy. Keep that thought in mind. Along with those deep recessions that occur when interest rates are used to cool down the economy, and the prospect of the economy hurtling downhill with pedals that are not working right, and the need to restore manufacturing before America is destroyed by the military and financial and economic threats that it would face as a post-industrial society, because it is time to describe a tool for addressing all of those problems. What America needs is a technical economics board. This would be a group of economists roughly analogous to the Federal Reserve Board. It would not be a policy-making board. Economic policy should come from elected officials. The function of this board would be to make the calculations that are needed to implement policy decisions of the legislative branch. It would follow instructions from the legislative branch under the supervision of the legislative branch. Its membership should be chosen in such a way that it is trusted and respected by Democrats and Republicans, by workers and employers, by consumers and investors, and by other segments of society. How should the Technical Economics Board be created? Well, I do not really care. It could be established by Congress. It could be initiated by the Federal Reserve Board. It could develop out of a group convened by an association of economists. Regardless of how it initially starts, its essential feature is that it is entrusted with specific instructions and responsibilities by the legislative branch of the federal government. It does not necessarily have to be created by the legislative branch, but it will not be able to fulfill its purpose until it meets with approval from the legislative branch and until it is given instructions and responsibilities by the legislative branch. What should those instructions and responsibilities be? For purposes of implementing my strategy for revitalizing manufacturing, the board would need to be given instructions along the lines described in the second talk of the series. It should be told to calculate how much revenue is needed to offset elimination of the payroll tax and the corporate income tax and any other overhead costs that come to be incorporated in the strategy. It should be told to identify initial rates for the new taxes based on its projections of how consumer prices will be affected by reductions in overhead costs. It should be told to make the tax on consumers just high enough to offset price decreases that result from eliminating the overhead costs. It should be told to make the tax on shareholders and other owners just high enough to provide the balance of required revenues. Most importantly, it should be told to adjust the statistics, the revenue targets, and the tax rates as often as necessary to keep them at the right level and to compensate for any past miscalculations. They would probably be reviewed each month, just like interest rates and monetary targets are reviewed each month by the Federal Reserve Board. That is pretty much what is needed from the Technical Economics Board for purposes of implementing my strategy for restoring manufacturing in America. But a board that is capable of filling that role can accomplish some other important things too. It can be the key to fixing America's brakes before it starts going downhill without them, ending the pattern of deep recessions that occur after increases in interest rates, moving the nation toward full employment without high levels of inflation, and reducing the national debt. The first step toward accomplishing those goals would be for the legislative branch to specify an employment target and an inflation target. Although such targets could be set by the Federal Reserve Board or the Technical Economics Board, this is one of the most important policy decisions that is made, so it makes sense for it to be made by elected officials. I think this would be an important increase, and a very appropriate increase, in the economic influence of the legislative branch. Would the legislative branch set reasonable targets for employment and inflation? I expect that it probably would, especially if the board suggests a range of feasible options to choose from. But it does not really matter whether the targets are reasonable or not. The Technical Economics Board and the Federal Reserve Board should either meet both targets if they are reasonable, or miss both targets by a similar amount if the targets are too optimistic, or surpass both targets by a similar amount if they are too pessimistic. Decisions would be guided just about as well by unreasonable targets as by reasonable ones. The important thing about these targets is that they represent a legislative value judgment about the balance to be struck between employment and inflation. The Technical Economics Board should then be given a role in operating the fiscal brake. This would involve calculating an adjustment factor that would be applied to income tax rates and to any other tax rates that the legislative branch wants to have adjusted. Under current economic conditions, that adjustment factor would be easy to calculate. At the present time, the appropriate number is 1. If you multiply a tax rate by 1, it does not change. There are relatively few goods and services that are rising in price because of too much money chasing after them relative to the quantity that can be supplied. General inflationary pressures do not require pressing down any harder on the fiscal brake at the present time. That will probably remain the case for some time into the future. Someday, however, that situation will change. Once the economy gains too much strength, then the tax factor should be increased to a number greater than 1. In other words, the only time the tax factor would be greater than 1 is when taxpayers are starting to spend more money than the economy can handle. Circumstances can also arise in which the factor should be less than 1. This tax factor should be revised as often as necessary, just as interest rates are revised as often as necessary. I would expect it to be routinely reviewed once per month, just as interest rates are routinely reviewed once per month. Revised factors should be applied to tax withholding rates and to quarterly payments right away. Then, toward the end of the year, tax tables should be calculated according to the adjustment factors that had been in effect during the relevant 12-month period. Thus, the fiscal brake would be even more responsive and more flexible than the conventional monetary brake. Its impact on consumer demand would be more immediate and more predictable than the impact of changes in interest rates. I do not think that it is an overstatement to say that America would then have the most effective economic brakes, the most responsive economic brakes, the most precise economic brakes, and the most balanced economic brakes of any nation in the history of the world. The most obvious advantage of having good brakes is that we would no longer face the danger of hurtling downhill without them. That is a pretty important advantage. Good fiscal brakes would also reduce the need to use the much cruder monetary brakes. That would mean less danger of severe national recessions. Having really good brakes would also make it safe to use the monetary accelerator. That would be a good thing because the monetary accelerator is already being used anyway. This accelerator is dangerous to use when the economy does not have good brakes, but having effective fiscal brakes in place would make it possible to use it more effectively. Being able to use it safely should make it possible to move more rapidly toward full employment without as much danger of inflation. Upgrading the fiscal brake would also make it possible to use the four pedals in a way that reduces the national debt. In recent decades, the economy has generally been stimulated through deficit spending, some combination of pressing harder on the fiscal accelerator with higher spending and easing up on the fiscal brake with lower taxes. Then, when the economy needs to be slowed down, it is generally slowed down with higher interest rates that make the national debt more burdensome. The resulting recessions lead to even larger deficits and a need to stimulate the economy with even more deficit spending. That would be a good way to manage the economy if your goal is to increase America's debt burden. It has been very effective in bringing about that result. If you want the opposite result, it would be good to use the pedals in an opposite manner. Stimulating the economy with the monetary accelerator causes debt to be avoided or eliminated or at least moved into the Federal Reserve. That can take the place of stimulating the economy with deficits. When it eventually becomes necessary to slow the economy down, that would be a good time for the legislative branch to ease up on the fiscal accelerator by making any appropriate reductions in spending. In addition to slowing the economy down, that would be good for the budget deficit. If the economy needs to be slowed down even more than that, then the Technical Economics Board can apply the fiscal brake. In addition to slowing the economy down, that would bring money into the Treasury to help balance the federal budget. That is a lot better than making the national debt more burdensome through higher interest rates. Of course, this approach to fiscal and monetary policy would not be a complete solution to the problem of America living beyond its means. The most problematic component of America's debt is the amount that businesses and the government owe to foreign countries. The first talk in this series explained that this component of America's debt will not be resolved until the trade deficit is resolved. So the true solution to America's pattern of living beyond its means was in my second talk, not in this one. The policies described in that talk should reduce the trade deficit, and that should reduce America's foreign debt and reduce the need for constant economic stimulus through fiscal and monetary policy. But until that true solution is achieved, the ideas in today's talk should make it possible for America to at least live beyond its means in a somewhat less disruptive way. I said earlier that I would not really mind a tax that did not reduce the amount of money that I had to spend on other things. The use of the fiscal brake that I have just described would actually go one better than that. Just the presence of such a brake should make it possible to stimulate the economy to the point where consumers and businesses approach an optimum level of spending power. That is quite a lot more spending power than we have had lately. The fiscal brake would then be applied to keep spending power at that optimal level. It would not reduce the nation's power to purchase goods and services. It would just reduce the power to generate inflation. The overall effect of that approach would be to increase the amount of money that America has to spend on other things. That is a better result than most people expect from an economic strategy that involves taxes. That concludes this series of talks. I hope that it has given you new hope and vision for revitalizing manufacturing in America, and that it leads you to start thinking about taxes in some new ways.